I hear people talk all the time about how much they love Sass, and I think what they really like is nesting, and now you can do it in native CSS. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. You can see that as the production version of Chrome 112 and above, you can use CSS nesting, and it's also in Safari Technology Preview, soon to come to Edge and any other Chromium-based browsers. Firefox, no sign yet, but we'll talk about that in a second. What I'd like to do in this video is talk you through 4 different things. First of all, why you might want to nest things in CSS. Number 2, the 3 rules that really make this make sense for you when you're actually using it in production. Thirdly, we're going to actually use this in a practical example and talk about some gotchas and edge cases. And then fourthly, we'll set this up with PostCSS so it will work in things like Firefox and any of the older browsers. As you can see, this is not exactly global yet, and so you'll have to be using something like PostCSS for a while to get this native CSS nesting to work across all browsers. Okay, so let's talk about it in that order. First of all, why might you want to use nesting? Well, I've got a basic HTML page open up over this way, and you can see I've got like featured cards, I've got containers with different random circles and squares and stuff like that. So let's say I'm in here and I say, hey, I want to take all my container and I want to just select the circles inside of here, and I want to change the background color, and I want to change it to aqua, sure. All right, just fine. Actually, that's a little hard to see since it's close to the other one, so let's say black. All right, so perfect, that works just fine, but I had to type container once, container twice. All right, so wouldn't it be nicer if I could instead just grab all of this, remove this right here, and just drop it right inside here? You can see how nice this is right here. Now the same thing happens, except here I am nested inside of here. So super nice when it comes to a dev experience. Now, sometimes with selectors, as you work with them, you're going to always want to have a certain selection tied to it. So what I mean by that is sometimes you'll have like a hover state. So if I came in here and said just on hover, now I want to change the background color and I want to change it, sure, we can just keep it at white. So what I'm doing is saying when the container is hovered, then change the background color. So super nice. Actually, you can't see that, can you? All right, let's come over here and change this back to black. All right, so it's super nice when the actual thing here is connected, the pseudo selector is connected directly to the actual element itself. You're never going to write this just like freestanding somewhere, so it's nice to actually have it connected to it. So that's the second reason why you might want to use it. Thirdly, I really like using this for media queries, and you can write them directly inside of here. So media and screen, or what is it, only screen? I always forget, only screen, and then right inside here, let's say something like max width of 700, sure, and 60 pixels. Okay, so now inside here, let's say inside here, now I want this to also turn to the background color of black. All right, so as long as it's basically smaller than 760, if I pull it out, you can see that this no longer applies. So really, really helpful when it comes to media queries and hovers. Now, I'll offer one word of warning, and that is I would really caution against using any kind of nesting outside of basically these 2 use cases. The reason is if you come in here and you say, hey, now give me all my circles inside here. And then you're doing something else inside here and you say, now I want my hover states inside here. Everything is so heavily nested that it becomes really hard to overwrite stuff later. And I think if you're learning CSS, I would just caution you against overly nesting things. If you're comfortable with CSS, then you probably know those gotchas anyhow, so don't worry about it. But that tripped me up a lot when I was first learning CSS and I started to dabble with Sass. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's now talk about the 3 rules that if you understand it, you'll understand everything you need to know about the basics of CSS nesting. Now, before I do, you're going to see here that I've got this syntax error showing up, and that's because it's only very recently that CSS opened this spec. So what you can do to get rid of that if you want is search for the PostCSS language support. We'll talk about that again at the end of the video, but then once you have that installed, you can go ahead and just change your document to PostCSS like this. And now it will get rid of those highlighting syntax errors. It'll still work no matter what, as long as you're in Chrome for now, but just so you know, if you're bothered by that, you can get rid of it. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 rules. First of all, you'll notice that most things can be nested like this, like a circle like this, or if I had this like as an ID or something like that. However, if you ever do need to use an ampersand, and we'll talk about when that's the case, the ampersand stands for the actual selector up here. So I could say ampersand.circle, and that would be the same thing as saying dot circle in this case. And again, I'll explain the difference between those and just change the background to something like pink. Okay, so now all these are pink. This ampersand, though, stands for the actual selector of container. Now note, I did not say the string dot container. It means the actual container. What that means is you cannot do things like bem styling. So I can't say small like this because this is the actual selector, not just the string dot container. All right, so that's an important distinction between Sass and this native CSS nesting. So the ampersand always stands for the actual selector. Rule number 2 is that the ampersand is required for all plain HTML tags. So in other words, I cannot come in here and just say, give me all the divs and change their background to pink. And the reason for that is that as CSS reads this, it realizes this is a class. As it starts to come down here, it knows this is a gap because it starts to read GAP and it's looking for an actual property selector. When it starts here though, it doesn't know if it's an actual property or if it's a tag. And so because of that, it can't go backwards. So it needs to know from the very first character, basically if this is a tag or not. So you can use anything that's like a colon, like an is selector, for instance, would be one, or hover. You can also use anything like a class, like a dot or an ID or anything like that. Anything that would be a normal, like kind of exterior selector, you can use that. However, if you're ever using a normal HTML element, you have to use an ampersand so that it signals to CSS that this is a nested element. We'll use that in several examples, but the third rule is that the ampersand is required for combo selectors. So let's say I had that circle like this circle right here, and if I wanted to ever combine these and say it had to be a container that also had the class of circle, I would need to make sure I had this ampersand so that it knows to put it there. In fact, if you don't have this on something like a class that doesn't need that ampersand normally, what it's actually doing behind the scenes is more like this, container space dot circle. All right, so if you don't want that space there, you actually have to put the ampersand right here, and it will basically combine the two and make it look more like this. So it has to have both of those, not the featured, but these two right here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So those are the 3 rules that will cover most of the use cases with this native CSS nesting. So ampersand stands for the actual external selector, not the string. Ampersand is required for all HTML tags, and then the ampersand is required for combo selectors. Now, just to show that first rule and how true it is, the ampersand stands for the parent selector. In this case, the parent selector is the HTML itself. So if I came in here and said background black, this is the same as writing HTML background black, all right, because this is the actual parent outside selector. This works with nested things as well. Now, this works with nested items as well. So I could say, give me the container, give me a circle inside of that. And let's say I came down here and I said also inside of here, I want to see any that are featured. And I want to say like background is going to be black. I'm not sure why I'm changing the background on everything, but this is featured. Now, what does this ampersand reference? It doesn't reference up here. It references its parent scope, which is this right here. So it's actually referencing this right here. That's the selector. And then it's saying it also has to have featured. So that's how the ampersand works. Again, that's kind of the first rule. All right, so let's talk through these 3 rules now in actual practice. Let me get rid of these, and you can see we've got small, medium, and large when it comes to these different shapes. Let's say I grab all of my smalls. All right, so this class does not need an ampersand because this little thing right here, this dot, signals that it's a class rather than just a normal CSS property. But let's say I come in here and I say I want to grab all the small ones that are circles or triangles. Well, there's a couple different ways to do this. I could go like this and say this needs to be a small and it needs to be a triangle. Now, you might think I could say, well, why don't I grab the triangle like this and then also grab the circle like this? The only problem with this, can you think what it's going to do? This is fine and valid, but it's actually going to look for triangles or circles inside of small tags. And really what I want is something that's small and triangle. All right, so what I need to do is add an ampersand here, which stands in this case for the parent, which is the .sm. Now let's think through this. Let's say I grab an outline and say it needs to be like, or how about a border? Border, 2 pixels, solid, and like, let's do blue. All right. So if I save that, you can see I get it on the circle, and on the triangle, I get this border color of blue. Now, if I were to write this out longhand, it would look like this. So this is essentially my selector right here, except it's a lot more brief to write it out this way. Okay, so that's one example of how to actually use this. Now, what I might also want to do is grab anything that's a sibling to a small element. Obviously, you can use something like a sibling selector or a general sibling selector. You can use the descendant selector. All of these will basically tell CSS, hey, this is something nested because, again, it's not an HTML tag. That's that second rule we talked about. You can also use things like not hot, but not, all right, just like this. So like not an anchor link or whatever. Now, just a note here, let's say you wanted to look at all the small tags and you wanted to look at their hover states. You might be tempted to do something like this, and this is a valid selector. However, because you don't have an ampersand here, it's going to actually add a space, which means it's going to look for anything inside of a small tag and then do the hover on that. Where really what we want is the hover directly on the small tag. That's what I mentioned a second ago, that you might need to use the ampersand more than you think, because this basically combines these two. Remember, the ampersand stands for this selector right here. So it's the same thing as writing dot small with this hover state right here. So with that said, let's say we come in here and I add now like background of black. All right, so with that said, anytime I have anything small and I hover over it, it should now turn black. Now, one thing to think about is, let's say you come down here and you say, let's add like a background of blue or something like this. All right, that's just fine and good. When I come in here, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to hover these right here. Now, this makes sense with specificity, but what it's actually also doing is hoisting up any properties, any CSS properties above any nested selectors. So if you have some up here and some below a selector, especially this would be the case with like media queries. So if I were to change this and set something like this, then it's going to actually overwrite it right here. But when I get smaller, you'll notice it turns blue, even though this comes afterwards. If I move this up, you'll notice it still stays blue. Here it comes blue. It doesn't really matter because it's going to hoist this to the top no matter what. Now, one more kind of application of this, I've got a featured card and I've also got a featured circle. And anything with featured has this box shadow. Now, of course, I could come in here and say, let me grab all my cards, and then I want to grab my dot featured on them, or maybe nest this and do dot featured. But one of the nice things you can do, because this featured, you might want to just say, hey, everything that's featured, I want to kind of be under this tag selector. What I could do is come in here and say, I want to grab all the cards, and by default, this will write it out like this, featured dot card, right, with that space between it. However, what I might want to do is say, I want to grab the featured, and I also want it to have this selector on it as well. So in other words, I want anything with card and featured, which basically makes it look like this. In fact, what it's going to do is move it like this, right? So now anything with card and featured should have this box shadow on it. So just like this, because again, this is not the string dot featured, it's the actual selector dot featured. Now what this means is you can keep all your featured things together and kind of like reference the parent more or less. And notice that only the card has that box shadow on it, whereas the circle no longer does because it is not a card and a featured class. All right, I hope that's at least a good introduction for you. There's a bunch more about how this works, but I thought I'd at least give you the introduction. Those three rules really will cover you most of the way with any questions you might have. All right, now lastly, I want to show you how to get started with PostCSS. Now I'm going to use something called Vite, which is a bundler, and then basically it installs PostCSS by default. So does Parcel, so do a lot of these things. So depending on your build tool, it probably already includes PostCSS, as does Vite here. So if I were to get started here and I were to search around for like PostCSS or something like that, let's see what they've got here. So yeah, it looks like you can actually build it directly in the PostCSS load config, which means you can actually put it in your package.json. So as long as I install whatever plugins I want, you can see I can just add something like this directly in here and use the plugins directly. So that's what I'm going to do. In fact, I'm going to open this up, close this down right here, and then let's go ahead and start with Vite. So I'm going to back out of here again, and let's just get started. Let's see. How does this work? Oh yeah. All right, so PNPM, let's use that, create Vite. And I'll call it Vite project, vanilla, JavaScript, that's fine. All right, so cd Vite project and PNPM install. And again, you might be using a different build tool. I just wanted to use one that's fast, so that's what I've got. Now, if I open up the sidebar here, you're going to see that I'm right inside this project now. What I want to do is actually drag this in here. So maybe let's just copy this out. You can grab all the code for this in the description, by the way, and I'll do the same thing over here. All right, so let's do that, and I'll close this down. And again, let's make sure this is PostCSS just so it doesn't yell at us. That should work. And then let's go PNPM run dev. We'll come over here and we'll change this to localhost 5173. Perfect. All right, so there it is. Same thing. It's working now officially. Let me close down the sidebar. And then let's come back over here. You can see that I just need to add a PostCSS thing to my package.json for Vite. You can do it a bunch of different ways too. You can add a PostCSS config if you'd like as well, but I'm just going to say PostCSS like this, and I'll need to add a comma here. And the plugin you're going to want to add is called PostCSS Nesting. Now, it's not PostCSS Nested. That's actually SAS-style nesting. This is actually trying to follow the CSS spec so that you can write that modern thing. And you can see that they're actually giving you examples here. Here's the descendant selector. Here's that ampersand. All those examples of media query. So anyhow, they're showing you how to get that started. I'm going to just grab this right here and go ahead and copy this in. Close this down first. We'll go pm install PostCSS. Actually, all I need is PostCSS nesting because, again, Vite includes PostCSS by default. Now, with that said, I'm going to come back in here and pm run dev and get that up and running. And then I simply need to add here PostCSS nesting. All right, and this needs to be in quotation marks like this, and we'll just close it out there. All right, let's just overwrite it. That should work. Okay, so, all right, obviously this is going to work no matter what because I'm already in Chrome, but if I were to copy this right here, and jump over to Firefox and paste it in up here. And let me come back over here and just restart this, pm run dev. There you go. You can see it's now working in Firefox. So what PostCSS does is it basically takes whatever modern CSS you're writing and makes sure that it works for all browsers. In fact, you're probably using something called auto prefixer already, and that's another way of basically backfilling for older browsers. This just does it for a specific feature in modern CSS, which is PostCSS nesting. I hope this video at least gets you started with using CSS nesting. Those 3 rules I think will really come in handy as you get started. If you have any questions or if I can be a help in any way, please let me know, and I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.